Hi, Doug Dormer here. This is Module 3, Lesson 2, Consumer Health Informatics, Empowering the Patient as a Consumer. And in this Lesson 2 of Module 3, I want to talk about the implications of regulation, Part 1. Now, if you recall, we talked a lot about the Cures Act in our regulation and legislation module. We talked about the Cures Act of 2016. And we talked about the idea of information sharing, information blocking, that under the law now, you cannot prohibit patients from getting access to the information. And we talked about interoperability, that mandates that say that providers must use technology that is capable of sharing information and must actually share that information amongst providers, including the consumer, through consumer health informatics applications. Now we're going to kind of drill a little bit more in a more targeted way, not at what the legislation is, but at what does it mean for those of us involved in consumer health informatics, either as a designer, a vendor, or a user, or a patient. So again, the first is the notion of OpenID. OpenID is required. OpenID or better is required under the Cures Act, something called the final rule, and it allows for complete access, transfer, and use of all electronically accessible health information. Now, OpenID is the authentication tool. It says, this is how we know who you are. And OpenID is significant because, as we discussed last week, one of the big shifts because of the Cures Act is to say, let's adopt other technologies that are in use broadly in industry, across the country, in retail, in manufacturing, in finance today. OpenID to authenticate who you are is one of those. So that means it's now saying that it shouldn't be something separate, and that means as a developer or a user, you're saying, oh, all right, I know how to authenticate each of the people who's going to use this system, and it's the same as I do for all my other systems. So that's a good thing. So we use OpenID for authentication. Then we will use OAuth 2, which is another standard for authorization. OAuth 2, if OpenID says for authentication says, I know who you are. OAuth 2 for authorization says, and I know what you're allowed to do in the system. So those are the two distinctions. We go into this in a fair bit more detail in my class for my students earning their master's degree, but this cursory level discussion should be enough to get you a sense of what we're talking about and probably touch upon things you already know. So and then the third thing we need to talk about as a part of this is something called SMART, the Smart Application Launch Framework. And I'm going to come to that in just a minute. So OpenID Connect, that's the authentication piece that we talked about here. It's API friendly and as easy as could be. So it means that as a developer of consumer health informatics technology of whatever sort, just follow the standard, incorporate what the standard intends for OpenID, and you've got authentication pretty safely handled. And again, some places you can go to get brushed up on that. OAuth 2, same thing, but for authorization. What are you allowed to do? It reduces complexity and allows users to have a simple workflow to access healthcare websites and apps. And again, a link to some material on it. Smart on FHIR. Just love the sound of that all by itself. FHIR, we talked about, is the protocol for exchanging information, regardless of what the native the formats of the data might be in separate systems. FHIR allows you to communicate between systems, regardless of what standard information is stored in the source or destination systems. SMART is interesting. Substitutable medical application reusable technology. I want to draw a distinction here. There is another SMART that those of you who are in the tech world will know about: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-based. So that SMART, the other one, refers to really goal setting in a technology world and beyond technology, but I think of it in the technology world. That ain't this. This is specifically a protocol, a framework relating to information and the ability to not exchange information, but to move between applications. Excuse me. So the smart framework, Smart on Fire, is this is an oversimplification, so I'm going to qualify that right up front. I tend to think of it as single sign-on steroids. So single sign-on means it's easy to log into multiple applications through one sign-on. This allows you to move back and forth between applications, move from the EHR to your consumer health informatics or other complementary tools. It really creates an effective ecosystem for managing personal health information. Hugely important. And again, standardized. So as long as you follow the guidance and you plug it in up front, it means that you can take your consumer application, whether it was developed for the consumer or for the provider, and move it around, integrate it into the environment of the ecosystem without it being terribly burdensome. What a liberating thing to do. And of course, here's a little bit more. What Smart on Fire means for the future of healthcare. Let's see. So what does the Cures Act say about SMART? Let's see. I'm going to kind of skim this stuff. We go into more detail, as I say in the class, but you don't really need to here. It includes providing access to all data elements of a patient's electronic health record to the extent permissible under applicable laws. And as I say, it's easy to implement if you just plan that you're going to do it from the start. What does that mean for consumer health informatics? What are the takeaways? Well, it means that CHI apps can easily be connected to EHR systems and other apps without, hopefully no custom programming, but with some configuration and planning. It means that meaningful use, we talked about that again in the regulatory and legislative history, now called promoting interoperability programs, that notion of exchanging information that you must be able to do in order to achieve the best funding from Medicare, Medicaid, and even private insurers plans. And so using these programs, OpenID, these standards, OAuth 2 and SMART, really sets you up to be able to meet the highest levels of interoperability with respect to these aspects in a fairly streamlined, simple way. It means developers can focus on the core of their product, not the connectivity or interoperability. It leads to increased consistency in health information exchange, where I'm distinguishing between a proprietary or a platform that is used by a provider and the notion of exchange across the community or indeed through a national health information network nationally, so that anywhere, any provider or any consumer health application should have full access to all of your information. And it leads to better and more competition among CHI vendors because it says these core characteristics of authentication, authorization, and interoperability are available to everybody. They can't be used to distinguish or to create barriers. They can't be used to increase the switching cost, to make it harder for you to say, you can't leave my product. I have features, you have to stay with me. You can't go to somebody else. This is part of that breaking down barriers that we talked about in the regulatory environment, particularly around the Cures Act. Oh, yes. And it may blur the lines between patient-directed and provider-directed healthcare. It allows us to really expand the role of the patient. It facilitates. It's not the driver, but it facilitates that transition. All right, that's it for the first part. Come back again, and we'll talk a little bit more about the incentives that come out of this regulatory environment. We'll see you when you get here.